Welcome back to another edition of the Week in Review. Things look very different here. We're going to be talking about that here in just a sec. But if you're watching, obviously a new vibe here. We're going to get into what that's all about. But a lot to cover. We've got the accountability phase of the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga continuing this week. We've got a sentencing hearing at the federal level and a big plea deal at the state level. I'm going to talk with Dylan Nolan about the former and our research director, Jen Wood, about the latter. After that, we're going to talk about a new series that has just been launched at FITSNews. It's called Unsolved Carolinas, cold cases in North and South Carolina that we've been digging into. Can't wait to tell you about that. We've also got an update on the justice system in South Carolina. A lot of talk about judges. We're going to dive into another part of the issue, the prosecutors, and a little back and forth between law enforcement and a prosecutor here in the Midlands region of the Palmetto State. Some good exchanges there. Can't wait to tell you about those. Also, political news. We've got some developments in the 2024 presidential race we want to address involving a South Carolina candidate who could be exposed to a scandal of self-interest. And last but not least, an update on the days of our congressman's sex scandal. All the rage up in Greenville, South Carolina. We're going to update our statewide audience on everything that's happened with regard to that sex scandal. All that and more heading your way on the first week in review from our new digs. So we're starting off this week. I'm sitting here with our special projects director, multimedia journalist, Dylan Nolan. Dylan, it's different.
That is true.
Different here. What's going on? Where am I?
This is the first and last time that folks will be seeing this version of the FITSNews studio. We are in our new space here. We have been running around South Carolina this week. I've been spending a lot of time in the Low Country, so I haven't quite had the time to fully deck this new studio out, but I thought it'd be cool to give folks a little look at what the room is looking like, kind of naked. But we're working on building out FITSNews Studio 2.0, really 3.0. I'm pretty excited.
Yeah, this is our third set, so we do have our constellation. We've got our logo there. We've got our chessboard, because we're always playing chess here. Well, I'm playing checkers. You're playing chess. Somebody here's playing chess. But
Jennifer Wood's on the 4D chess.
She is, man. Our research director, Jen Wood, she has been playing 4D chess on the Murdaughs for a long time. But, Dylan, we're in the accountability phase of this investigation. We keep talking about that. We have the investigation phase. We have the court phases of it. Now we're moving into the phase where people are being held accountable for their roles in this scandal. And we saw more of that this past week with the federal sentencing of Cory Fleming. Cory Fleming, of course, is Alec Murdaugh's longtime friend. He's the godfather to Murdaugh's elder son, Buster Murdaugh, his surviving son. Fleming was an attorney who was involved in several of Murdaugh's fleecings, particularly fleecing the insurers in that Gloria Satterfield case where Alec Murdaugh manipulated the circumstances of Gloria Satterfield's death to enrich himself and Fleming. But also in the case of Hakeem Pinckney, deaf quadriplegic who was the victim of a horrific accident, Fleming involved in that fleecing as well.
And importantly, this money was coming from the insurance companies, but he was also fleecing the very needy people who should have been recipients of that money.
Absolutely. Dylan, all of this unfolding federally, the Cory Fleming situation, he has a state case coming up next month, September 15, which is kind of in the air now that this federal deal has been reached. But you covered both the Cory Fleming sentencing hearing, and then 2 weeks earlier, as we talked about on this show, you covered the sentencing hearing for Russell Laffitte, another Murdaugh-related defendant. And we've got a real tale of two defendants here, don't we?
Yeah, it was very interesting. You saw Russell Laffitte. I mean, he's fighting it. He's still fighting. He's filed his notice of appeal. Cory Fleming fell on the sword. He began cooperating months ago, revealed to investigators information that they did not know at the time. So it was a completely different tenor of how the day went. And it ended appropriately with Fleming surrendering himself to the U.S. Marshals in the courtroom, beginning his sentence then and there.
Wow, vastly different, obviously, from Laffitte, who
He's trying to stay out on the street as long as possible. I mean, he's going to be putting some more money into some attorneys' pockets, but I think he'll eventually end up where Fleming is going.
Well, let's talk about the attorneys here. Clearly, two different tacks. Debbie Barbier representing Cory Fleming, former federal prosecutor, but then representing Russell Laffitte was a former U.S. attorney, Bart Daniel. Did you notice any differences in the styles of these attorneys representing these defendants, their approaches?
I don't even think it's fair to compare the attorneys, because when you're an attorney, you're representing your client at the end of the day. So if your client is Russell Laffitte and says, I want you to go into court and say, I didn't do this, it's very different than your client saying, I want you to basically get the feds to go as lightly as they can, given the circumstances, if I provide them with information and cooperate. So Debbie Barbier definitely had a lot easier of a job than Russell Laffitte's legal team did, because they were both obviously guilty, but one of them is trying to fight that.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk numbers. Obviously, there's a difference in the outcomes for both of these defendants, in addition to their differences in approaches, differences in strategies. Talk a little bit about those numbers.
Yeah, Cory Fleming is going to be going to prison for roughly 4 years, and Laffitte roughly 7. The interesting thing, though, is people say, oh, wow, Judge Gergel went so light. That's not where this decision is really made. The decision for how long you're going to end up going to jail is made by the U.S. attorney when they decide what to charge you with. Fleming's a great example. He fits the bill. He could have been charged with wire fraud, which carries a maximum sentence of 30 years, which would have moved his sentencing guidelines just up in general. So even if they charged him on the low end, it still would have been more time. But since they chose not to bring those charges, that was never on the table. And when Barbier was asking for a below guideline sentence, this was actually something that Judge Gergel brought up. And I think, he knows that the media is watching. He knows that there's a lot of people there who don't understand the federal sentencing or federal court process extremely well. And I think he wanted to put out there and put on the record, even in this kind of sly way, look, you can't get mad at me for not throwing the book at him when the charges that were brought were never intended to do that.
Well, let me throw a little curveball at you. I know we're talking about these specific defendants and their sentences, but let me throw you this question. Should judges have more flexibility in cases like this? Should prosecutors have all the power when it comes to these sentences?
Well, I mean, obviously a judge can't, if you're not convicted of a crime, if the crime was never charged, the judge can't do anything about that, and that there's never going to be a system where a judge can just pull out of their head a number and give you, well, at least I hope there will never be a system like that in America. But the federal sentencing guidelines have been weakened as far as how much judges have to stick with them through Supreme Court decisions over the years. So judges have a fair amount of latitude as to how to interpret the federal sentencing guidelines.
Prosecutors in both cases, though, seemed pleased with the sentences that were handed down.
I mean, with Mr. Fleming, they basically held his hand and walked him into prison for the amount of time that they agreed on, so of course they were pleased. It's not like they got an outcome other than exactly what they wanted when they walked into court.
So fighting the law wins in Russell Laffitte's case, going along with the law, and a little bit better outcome for Cory Fleming. What's some of your root takeaways of this whole thing, Dylan, having been there in person, watching these proceedings every day of the Laffitte trial, the Laffitte sentencing, the Fleming sentencing, covering all these things? What are some things that struck you as you watched these trials?
If you're guilty of sin, cooperate. Definitely. They're going to make you go to prison for longer if they have to spend hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars of federal resources prosecuting you, and honestly, they should. To me, it just seems light that these people who are in such positions of trust in society can, I mean, I don't know. What is the appropriate sentence? That's something that is definitely above my pay grade, but 4 years for that? And I get it. He's contrite, but he was only contrite after he was caught.
There were some attorneys at the hearing that raised that point.
Justin Bamberg. He said, look, I thank you for the apology, but I don't even believe this is genuine, which it's crazy to say. We're at a sentencing hearing, but it seemed like he was the only one in the room who wasn't like Team Cory.
That's
okay, Eric Bland, sorry. Eric Bland came in there with a sledgehammer. Mm-hmm. Can't forget that. But even the prosecution was talking about, how much it means that he came to them. And that's great, but still, for the span of like the 10 years he was committing those crimes, he didn't seem to have any of that contrition.
Absolutely enabling and empowering Alec Murdaugh in his schemes.
When we catch a serial killer living a two-faced life, we don't say, oh, well, you're sorry for it now that we caught you. But if it's a white-collar criminal who everybody in the community likes and has a hard time believing even committed those crimes, I guess it's a different approach.
I guess the question is, where was his apology and where was his contrition when he was ripping these people off?
Yeah, where was that sense of morals?
Yeah.
And I get it. People have to fall, and people can change, but also it doesn't mean that society should not punish you harshly to prevent people from doing that in the future.
Well, we heard from the feds 2 weeks ago when Russell Laffitte was sentenced, all about sending a message. The rhetoric toned down a little bit in the aftermath of this hearing, though.
And I will say, Fleming's life is ruined. I mean, he's never going to practice law again. He's never going to be able to hold a white-collar type job where you're trusted, to oversee people's assets. But I don't know how much of a deterrent this was.
Really?
Now, the nice thing is the state is going to come and do their thing as well. And that's something that was very interesting to hear the federal prosecutors talk about, because you can tell that they're used to, as soon as the feds arrive on the scene, the big boys are here. Well, the state didn't feel that way. They wanted to follow these charges, and maybe they didn't feel that way because they knew that the feds were going to do something like this, and they want to put Fleming in jail for an amount of time that they feel is more appropriate. I'm not sure. We'll have to wait and see how things break in the state legal system.
We will know soon. And again, I'm glad you raised that. There's been a lot of tension between the prosecutors, federal and state, as it relates to these Murdaugh-related charges. Some very bad blood between the Office of U.S. Attorney Adair Ford Burroughs and South Carolina Attorney General Alan Wilson on that. But it looks like the judges in these cases are going to be, at the very least, having a dialogue about this. Judge Gergel indicating he was going to reach out to...
Well, he asked Barbier to give a complete transcript of the proceedings to Judge Newman and said that the case couldn't be in better hands, and I agree with him. So he wants all of the things that he considered to come before that court, and I think that that's appropriate. But I could also understand why state prosecutors might want him to spend a more significant amount of time behind bars to set the message that this is not something that's appropriate for members of the South Carolina bar.
Absolutely, and that message needs to be sent in South Carolina, folks. We're going to talk in a moment with Jen Wood, who's been exposing all sorts of malfeasance and bad behavior in our probate court system, as well as other incidents like this. We're going to dive into that and some other Murdaugh-related stuff with Jen Wood. But first, Dylan, thank you not only for getting us here to this new set, can't wait to see what you do with it, but also just for the amazing journalism you've done over the last few months on these federal cases.
The accountability matters, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Damn right, brother. All right, Jen, let's hit it on these other Murdaugh-related charges. All right, so with our Director of Research, Jen Wood, as I just noted, the sentencing hearing for Cory Fleming wasn't the only accountability that came down in the Murdaugh crime and corruption saga this past week. A plea deal at the state level on a defendant that has some interesting connections to the Murdaugh empire. Jen, walk us through who's the defendant, what were the charges, and why does it matter?
So, yeah, we've been following a number of cases that have spiraled out of the Murdaugh crime and corruption saga. And one of them was Jerry Rivers, 40 years old from Walterboro, South Carolina, who was indicted in August of 2022, which it was kind of a surprise indictment. They sprung that on us during Eddie Smith's bond hearing. So everybody was listening as they were indicting these two individuals, Jerry Rivers and Spencer Roberts, and realized that the indictments were tied to the Murdaugh investigation. So it was pretty interesting. So back in August 2022, he was indicted for obstruction of justice when investigators raided a gambling den in Walterboro, and he swiped a cell phone trying to hide it from Spencer Roberts. They've never found that phone.
Oh, wow. And again, Curtis Eddie Smith, Alec Murdaugh's drug dealer, check casher. And Jen, you've connected these guys, tens of thousands of dollars exchanged between Curtis Eddie Smith and Jerry Rivers. Walk us through that connection real quick.
So according to, they were going through his plea agreement, they did give us some details. And it sounds like what they say happened was Rivers was selling oxycodone pills to Eddie Smith, who was paying him via checks and cash. So there was $88,000 worth of checks written for these drugs. Let's go back to the fact they're writing checks for drugs.
I was about to say, you got to love a drug dealer that takes credit.
So he was, and this was around the time COVID kind of shut down the world, and So it sounds like they're saying Eddie was getting the drugs from Rivers and Associates and passing them along to Alex.
Oh, wow. Now, do we think, again, as this plea agreement unfolds, Prosecutor Creighton Waters has spoken about the cooperation that's expected from Rivers on this plea agreement, and he received a reduced bond, originally $300,000. The bond that was set for him, his family couldn't make that. That has been cut in half by Judge Clifton Newman to $150,000. But all of this contingent on his cooperation with the investigation. And Jen, he's facing, what is it, minimum of 5, potentially 20 years?
5 to 25 years, I believe they said. And, it is, his plea agreement is all contingent on his cooperation with their ongoing investigation.
And that's a key word, ongoing.
Correct.
Now, you've connected Rivers to some pretty bad hombres. Is that correct, Jen? This guy's been tied to some of these Walterboro Cowboys.
These infamous Walterboro Cowboys, which is a local gang, and sounds like he was connected to the boss of the Cowboys, Kyrie Broughton, also known as K Blocka. He was indicted.
I want a gang name. Can I get a gang name up in here?
Yeah, but right. Kyrie Broughton, he was indicted and found guilty on federal charges related to gang activity, including RICO. And fun fact, he was released from federal prison and placed on parole in April of 2023, and he broke his parole. He was charged with gun charges related to guns, transfer of guns, selling guns, and he is back in jail awaiting additional court activity.
So we've got the Cowboys connection to Alec Murdaugh, but Jen, as you and I well know, the drug connections to Alec Murdaugh go much deeper than just the Cowboys and the local gangs that are dealing these various drugs, allegedly. There's also the story of Barrett Bowler. Tell us a little bit about this guy, Jen.
Barrett Bowler he died in 2018, was a shrimp boat fisherman based out of Beaufort, South Carolina, low country, right on the coast. And he had a number of charges in the 80s related to trafficking of marijuana, utilizing his boats. Definitely an interesting case. And right when he was about to go to trial in federal court relating to those charges in Florida, the key witness, I believe Franklin Branch, died in a car accident or got hit by a car in the middle of the night. So they were not able to pursue those charges.
Wow. We reported a lot of this, back in the fall of 2020.
Alex and Barrett owned a number of barrier islands off the coast of St. Helena that are they're all in a very interesting location.
Lookouts, basically.
Lookouts, yep. Deep water docks on some of them.
Oh, wow.
Makes you wonder what was going in and out of there.
Well, I don't think we have to wonder, but I think one of the things that we are continuing to wonder is how did all of these connections connect, for lack of a better term? How was Alec Murdaugh tied to these drug dealers, and both at the macro level with the smugglers that were linked into the Operation Jackpot that you just mentioned, but also the small-time drug dealers? It's still a mystery, isn't it, Jen?
It's still a mystery. And Alex's lawyers themselves referred to this as Ozark-like, meaning that it was much more intricate than people understand. And I certainly, based on what I've seen, believe that.
Well, and Jen Wood, you continue as we dig into all these different pleas. You're also doing amazing work. Just this past week, you dropped your first installment of Where Did the Money Go? Detailing a lot of Alec Murdaugh's Palmetto State Bank activity. We're going to dive into that in some future editions because you've done incredible research there. But I wanted to shift gears with you, if you're cool. I wanted to ask you about a new series that's launching on FITSNews, and I wanted you to give some of the genesis of this new series as it relates to this big investigation, the Long Island serial killer. You and our reporter researcher Callie Lyons, in the aftermath of that case, started digging into those South Carolina connections. But as you were digging, something struck you, didn't it, Jen?
Yeah, Callie and I were both digging through databases of missing people, trying to see if there were any individuals that fit the Long Island serial killer's profile. Small, Caucasian, petite women, usually under the age of 35. And as we were digging, it struck us just, as we were narrowing down our search parameters, it struck us how many people were getting cut out of that list and how many people were missing. And Callie said to me, it's just so sad that there's so many people, loved ones, just missing somebody, waiting for answers, not knowing where their loved one is. And I said, I think there's something we can do about that. And we started talking and came up with an idea to highlight some of these unsolved cases, these missing individuals to, after they go missing, there's always this, huge, you see the press out there, they're getting the coverage, everybody's looking. And then when there aren't answers, the press gets bored and it dies down. The investigation's continuing in most cases. And we wanted to kind of start highlighting those. And you go, these families have these Facebook pages, justice for, bring so-and-so home, searching for, and that's how they're getting information out. And I thought, maybe if we can work with some of these individuals in the law enforcement, we can give case updates, highlight, what we know, what they found out since the initial public push for information, and, give a better idea of who these people are. Hopefully we can, get the spotlight on these cases again and help find answers. And, everybody, when somebody's missing and something's unsolved, somebody knows something somewhere.
Absolutely. That's right. Somebody knows something somewhere. That's right. Every one of these cases. And Jen, I wanted to ask you about this because you previewed a few of these stories just as a way of introducing this new feature and inviting our readers, not only in South Carolina, but North Carolina. This is a Carolinas, Unsolved Carolina. So we're covering both states here. We're reaching up into that, across the border into the Tar Heel state here. But how do folks who have a case that they want us to look at, whether it's, again, an unsolved disappearance, an unsolved murder, how can they get in touch with us? And what sort of information should they provide to you and your team as you guys start digging into these stories?
Absolutely. So shoot me an email. It's research@fitsnews.com. That's FITSNEWS.com. And just provide some details, send me a link to, any profiles that are in the missing persons databases, anything that you have, and I will connect with you and we'll get some more information and see if we can't get your case highlighted.
Absolutely. And you've got a big case that you're preparing a report on. I don't want to spoil it because you were sharing some details with me the other day, and it's just unbelievable. A story of 3 folks that went missing. I believe it was back in early 1987, Jen. It's just such a compelling story, not only what happened, but what we don't know.
What we don't know. And I mean, the case is still open 36 years later. Nobody knows where these 3 people went. So yeah, we'll be highlighting that very soon, hopefully this week, and hopefully get some answers, figure out what happened to these people, because it's just shocking to me that 2 women and a child can just disappear. Just
vanish, literally vanish. One of them a 2-year-old girl, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Well, Jen, it's amazing. And what I really love about that series is, and I wanted you to tell that story, and I'm so glad you did, was how it started, was you and Callie working together, trying to, again, focus on a breaking news story. But as you were doing that, noticing, wait a minute, there are all these other people. They didn't fit the criteria of this famous alleged killer. I guess we still call him an alleged killer at this point. But their stories matter too. And just the heart that you bring to this and Callie brings to this, just can't thank you enough for it. I know that it fuels so much of what you do, and just very grateful for it, Jen.
Oh, thanks.
So earlier this week, Our Cali Lions filed an updated report on the Green Pond Massacre. We've been talking about this case for a while. It's just probably the most horrific story we've covered, and I don't say that lightly. We've covered a lot of bad stuff here at FITSNews, true crime, corruption. We've covered a lot of terrible things, but this story, a mass stabbing followed by an arson attack, sexual assaults of multiple young female victims. I mean, all of it wrapped into one just horrific narrative. And Cali reported earlier this week on some of the warrants that were released in connection with the Green Pond Massacre. And you can read that report on FITSNews.com, where we've been covering this story. But I wanted to zero in on part of this story that we've been talking about from the very beginning. Not a lot of other media outlets have been talking about it. They are very quick to focus on the graphic, gory, headline-grabbing details, and I get that. They're certainly there in abundance in this story, but we try to put all of the news that we cover in context to try to tell you why some of these things have been allowed to happen. And that context in this case is crucially important. And I want to talk about that quickly because it involves South Carolina 14th Circuit Solicitor Duffy Stone. If you've followed our news outlet for some time, you know we've spoken of him not often in glowing terms. And in this case, Duffy Stone's office had multiple interactions with the perpetrator, the accused perpetrator of the Green Pond Massacre. And again, this guy, Ryan Leonard Manigo, a butcher by trade, an actual butcher at a local grocery store down there in the Walterboro, South Carolina region. This guy was arrested, charged, and in one case actually incarcerated. He did serve some prison time. But we're talking about a lot of the same violent, sexual-based assaults, charges that should have had him in jail at the time that this attack took place on the morning of July the 2nd of this year. Ryan Manigo should have been behind bars at the time that this attack took place, and we are still waiting for Solicitor Stone to offer some explanation as to why he wasn't, as to why so many charges against Manigo were not prosecuted or not indicted or dismissed, and why also was he given a sweetheart deal from Judge Perry Buckner down there. Again, another name that's familiar to those of you who followed a lot of the corruption down there in the Low Country. Perry Buckner, a judge very close to the fallen Murdaugh empire. And again, I want to be clear here. We've bashed Duffy Stone in the past. Maybe there are some explanations for some of these cases involving Manigo. Maybe there was a reason that the solicitor's office decided not to prosecute these charges. Maybe there were reasons that grand juries declined to indict. But we're waiting on those answers from Duffy Stone whenever he's willing to sit down with us or just speak on background. We're happy to do that and want to hear his side of the story. But this points to something that we need to discuss, because you've followed this news outlet. If you follow this news outlet for any amount of time, you know we've been bashing judges. We go after judges when they fail to hold violent criminals accountable, when they give sweetheart plea deals, excessively lenient sentences, when they dole out ridiculously low bonds. Again, the end result of all of this is it keeps violent offenders back on the streets when they should be locked up. And the end result of that, more violence, more victims, and a material erosion in the public safety of the Palmetto State. So we talk about the judges a lot, and they deserve a lot of blame. But solicitors are also part of the problem. And this past week on FITSNews, there was a big story from Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott, a guy who hasn't gone on the record often with this news outlet, but Sheriff Lott and I spoke earlier this month, and we filed a big report earlier this month in which he specifically pointed to some outcomes in the South Carolina 5th Judicial Circuit. And Sheriff Lott did not call out 5th Circuit Solicitor Byron Gibson by name, but he did point to some cases from that office, particularly a case involving a thrice-convicted drug trafficker who also had multiple weapons charges and other violent crimes on his record, who was represented by none other than Todd Rutherford, one of the most powerful lawyer legislators in South Carolina, and a guy who seems to be at the center of so many of these judicial leniency stories where violent repeat offenders are shown incredible grace from a system that should be holding them accountable. And Sheriff Lott was very blunt. He said that there's no incentive for these criminals to stop doing what they're doing because they know the system will not hold them accountable. And he specifically, again, pointed to one of these cases involving Rutherford and Solicitor Gibson. Well, Solicitor Gibson pushed back a bit on this, and I sat down with him at length very recently, and we published a story just this week detailing his response. And I wanted to talk about it because it is important, because we need to know why these things keep happening. And Gibson did raise what I think are some fair points. First of all, he pointed to his office's record, recent convictions, recent plea agreements, including several dozen pleas, which resulted in defendants being sentenced to over a decade. And that matters. Those are important outcomes. And he talked about several recent trials, including a trial that our news outlet covered that resulted in a life sentence for one of these violent defendants. And those outcomes matter. But I guess my point back to a lot of that would be this. This is a job where violent criminals in every case need to be locked up. And if you're batting 500, that's great in baseball. 650, that's phenomenal, unheard of in baseball. In fact, there's only one hitter that ever hit over 400 in a year, Ted Williams, the splendid splinter. But here's the problem. As a prosecutor, batting 400, 500, or 600 isn't going to cut it, especially if you've got violent defendants like this that are kept on the streets, turned back out on the streets, and again, fundamentally not being held accountable. But Gibson talked about this issue, and he spoke at length about some of the problems that we're facing. He talked about shortages in law enforcement that keep cops from being able to attend certain hearings, shortages prosecutorially. And in fact, he praised state lawmakers for funding retention and recruitment efforts that let him and other solicitors across the state bring in more talented lawyers and keep them on staff. He also talked about shortages in judges and how all of this was taking place against an uptick in violent crime, a surge in warrants being presented to his office and, again, the offices of all the other solicitors across the Palmetto State. And so this is something I think that we've got to start looking at more holistically. And I want to say, FITSNews, we've got to do that too, because we've been so focused on the judges. We've been so focused on these corrupt lawyer-legislator relationships that impact those decisions. Because again, if you're a lawyer-legislator in South Carolina, one of only 2 states in the country where the legislature appoints these judges, and not only that, where a clique of legislators controls a committee that decides which ones they get to vote on, every part of that process is controlled by the Todd Rutherfords of the world, by the Micah Caskies of the world, by these lawyer-legislators, Leon Stavronakis, all these guys who make bank off of that influence. At the end of the day, that's what they do. They make money off that influence. I mean, if I were to murder someone, I'd hire Todd Rutherford because I'd never have to go to court. And if I did have to go to court, I'd get some lenient bond. Gerald Malloy, another lawyer-legislator who, again, makes a living keeping these violent criminals from being held accountable. And on one level, that's their job. I get that. That is what they get paid to do. But being able to have the influence that they have over the judges, again, whether they get appointed or reappointed, what their office budget is, whether they get raises or not, it's an indescribable influence. And if you think that that isn't influencing the judge's decision-making process, then again, we've got some oceanfront real estate to sell you in the state of Nebraska. But as we continue to cover this, and I want to thank Byron Gibson for stepping up and speaking with me on the record. Again, I know he wanted to defend his office, but he did give me a lot to think about as it relates to this problem, how it is multifaceted and how there are factors that are at play that impact it. And again, one of the other points he noted, it's societal in nature. He talked about Richland County, how it's more difficult in Richland County than it is in, say, Lexington County across the river to get a jury that will convict. He talked about the old snitches get stitches maxim, how so many cases that they are presented with, victims and witnesses refuse to cooperate and provide key testimony because they're afraid of retaliation and retribution. So there are a lot of factors at play. Every story is different. Every story has multiple angles. And I want to remind everyone in our audience that unlike a lot of the folks in the media marketplace, at this news outlet, this mic is always open, whether it's to Solicitor Gibson, to Sheriff Lott, or to any elected official or appointed official or any victim, anyone who has an intelligent take on this issue or any of the issues that we cover. You're welcome to take this mic and share that perspective with our audience. But as for how we use this mic, make absolutely no mistake. We will continue to push for the accountability for these repeat violent offenders and for a system of judicial selection and an overall justice system that seeks that same accountability. It's a big week of politics here at FITSNews, and there was actually one event that had me venture out from our little lair here. I rarely do it. I've got a little touch of the tism, as they say. I don't know if that's politically correct, but a little socially anxious, but did get to venture out this week to an event. I'm going to tell you about that in just a sec. But as we inch closer to the 2024 presidential primary election here in South Carolina, first in the South, and as we start looking beyond, a lot of candidates, a lot of elected officials making moves to start positioning themselves as they see where that 2024 election is going. But the first thing I want to talk about, we've been given some credit here at this news outlet to Nikki Haley. And in fact, we've talked on this show about how Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina, former ambassador to the United Nations, and again, I shudder to think what Dylan is putting up on the screen as it relates to my history with the governor. I think we've done that joke so many times now that he's probably run out of stuff to put up. So anyway, but Nikki Haley, we've given her some credit in this campaign because she has been driving the debate in the Republican nominating fight in the right direction. Nikki, one of the only candidates who has spoken out about entitlements, about the unsustainability of our fiscal republic, of our current system, driving other candidates like Ron DeSantis of Florida, who's the number 2 candidate in this race, pushing the narrative, pushing them to take more aggressive stances on these important issues. So I've credited Nikki Haley for her role in the 2024 race up to this point. But this week we're going to throw a little shade her way, and deservedly so. There's a big story out of the Daily Beast. Now, this is a left-leaning media outlet, and I know John Avlon, the guy that started, is a good guy, but this is an outlet that definitely veers to the left. They are not looking for a lot of bad behavior on the progressive side. They're definitely looking for it, though, on the side of Republican conservative politicians, and Nikki Haley has really served them up something on a platter. It involves a defense subcontractor based in Charleston County, South Carolina, that appeared mysteriously on her husband's net worth on a required FEC filing that Haley's campaign put together. $500,000. $500,000 her husband is supposed to be worth due to this defense subcontractor. And so, of course, this got the folks at the Daily Beast digging, got me digging as well. Unfortunately, not a lot of other media followed up on this. But this is a company that was created in Charleston County, apparently had no business license, has not paid any taxes, yet Michael Haley is worth $500,000 because of it. What is this company about? Started doing some digging. It belongs to a subsidiary which has applied for and apparently received, according to the Department of Commerce, your tax dollars. That's right, job development tax credits have been linked to this company. So credits from the administration of Henry McMaster flowing to a company that's tied to this subsidiary that Michael Haley's got $500,000 of a stake in. What gives here? What is this company doing? Well, we did some digging. Daily Beast also, their research on this is what we started with. It's a company that sends, or plans to send rather, military vehicles to Taiwan. That's right. This is one of the global flashpoints. You want to talk about the Middle East, you want to talk about Eastern Europe, South China Sea, and Taiwan, another one of these global flashpoints where American neoconservatives are aggressively pushing the weight of America's military-industrial complex. They want us to go in hot. They want us to go in heavy. They want us to pick fights, whether it's with Russia, whether it's with China. And Nikki Haley very aggressively rattling the saber when it comes to China. And in fact, not only rattling the saber just generically, but specifically saying that Taiwan needs the ammunition and equipment to be ready to push back against a potential Chinese invasion. Now, how interesting is that when she's got her husband, again, standing to make, if this company is worth $500,000 and hasn't even shipped a vehicle yet, imagine how much it's going to be worth when they actually start producing these vehicles, when they actually start shipping them to Taiwan. We're talking potentially tens of millions of dollars here. And Haley is specifically advocating for this in her role as a candidate for president of the United States. And again, I am saying this is self-interest. And while Haley is a neocon, has always been, funded her PAC by all the defense money, but this is a clear case of a politician espousing a policy that is directly tied to self-interest. And it would be one thing if that self-interest was something that she was open about and something that she specifically would disclose. But this was something, again, it's a subcontractor. It's a shady deal, people. It's a shady deal. And I would encourage everybody, before they think about voting for Haley or for any of these other candidates, find out what their real interests are, people. Because while Haley has everyone believe it's all about protecting America from the communist Chinese threat, and that may be true, clearly part of that motivation is making some bank for her husband, who, and again, Haley said a few weeks ago she didn't love her husband 100% of the time. My guess is she probably will be loving those big sweet dollars rolling in to that subcontractor bank account when the spigot gets turned on. But anyway, keep an eye on that, folks. Always look for the real motivation of politicians. And speaking of motivations of politicians, it was also a big week on the William Timmons front. Here at this news outlet, we don't like to cover sex scandals. Again, unless I'm in it, we try not to cover it because, again, that's a politician's personal life, and unless there's wasted tax money, abuse of power, some other related criminality, we try to just let the politicians do what they kind of want to do in their personal lives and stay out of it. But this was a scandal pushed on us. This was a scandal, unsolicited statement sent by the congressman, which we now believe was motivated by his desire to get out of a marriage. And he figured the best way to get out of the marriage is send a press release to FITSNews.com detailing his issues. So whatever the motivation, this scandal has morphed, it has expanded, it has blown up, and Timmons apparently has bit off a little more of this scandal than he could chew. But the driving force in this is the husband of his mistress, a guy named Ron Rawlis, an upstate real estate developer, a very wealthy guy, but a guy who was married to Paula Dyer, who was William Timmons' mistress. But Rawlis has been driving this scandal for a long time, and this past week, a couple things happened in this story that I think are very interesting as we approach a big court hearing up in Greenville, South Carolina. In fact, not a hearing, a trial. And we're going to tell you about that in just a sec. But Ron Rawlis this week went on his Instagram. It's Church Greenville, an Instagram account that has been very popular in the aftermath of the Timmons scandal. And he posted a picture of himself grooming his, I guess they call it a porn stash. I don't have one of those. I just got the normal goat, but rocking the porn stash. And in the reflection of his sunglasses, if you're looking at this on our YouTube page, you're seeing it right now, clown Congressman William Timmons, he's got it up there, just trolling the heck out of the congressman. But it wasn't that picture that got the attention. If you swiped over on that since deleted Instagram post, which we saved before it was taken down, Rawlis referenced something, or actually not referenced, he provided receipts for something that we reported this past week. And in our original report last week, updating everyone on the latest on this scandal, we pointed out that Congressman Timmons had allegedly threatened Rawlis as it related to this bitter, acrimonious custody divorce case that he's involved in with Timmons' mistress, Paula Dyer. And as you can see, if you're watching on our YouTube here, we've got a text message here where Timmons sent Rawlis a recap of his alleged, quote, criminal history, or his, interaction with law enforcement. And so Rawlis responded to the congressman, how am I to perceive this? How do you want me to take this? And Timmons very clearly pointed out that it's going to come up in this upcoming court hearing, essentially a threat, and reiterating that it is in Rawlis' best interest that he settle this case and not take it to court. Talk about making a guy an offer he can't refuse. But this story, This is one of the reasons we cover it. It started out as a sex scandal that kind of got pushed on us. It has turned into, as so many of these cases do, a corruption story about a congressman pushing the levers of power in his backyard in the hopes of generating an outcome from the justice system that benefits him and benefits his mistress. Now, as this case moves forward, we've already submitted our paperwork. We're going to bring as much access as we can, hopefully get some cameras in the courtroom up there in Greenville Family Court on September 18, 2023, when this case goes to trial. But there is so much at stake here. It's not just about people sending nude pics to each other and a salacious sex scandal. It's about the integrity of the justice system. But I will say, speaking of those pics and speaking of the salaciousness, we did get a missive this past week from Mistress Dyer herself, Paula Dyer, the woman at the center of this scandal, indicating her displeasure with our coverage and her intention to pursue legal action against this news outlet. We welcome that because, again, this is a case that deserves all the scrutiny it can muster, and any legal action brought by Miss Dyer, we believe, would ultimately enhance that scrutiny. And so, Mr. Dyer, we're more than ready to accept service on any actions that you bring. Happy to engage in that process with you because, again, like you, we want to know the truth about just how deep this congressional sex scandal really goes and what directions it is going to take all of us as we continue to follow it. But keep it tuned to FITSNews for the very latest on this Days of Our Congressman sex scandal involving 4th Congressional District Representative William Timmons. Keep it tuned to FITSNews for the latest on that, as we will bring you that court case from Greenville next month. All right, that is a wrap for this week's edition of the Week in Review, our first episode from the new studio. I cannot thank our Director of Special Projects, Dylan Nolan, enough for getting this pulled together in record time. And we had a busy week this week, people. In fact, I want to preview real quick. We've got a huge interview dropping middle part of next week. Lisa Lynch. She is the woman at the heart of the scandal that has enveloped the Beaufort County government down there, one of the fastest growing, wealthiest regions of the Palmetto State. Lisa Lynch has come forward, and it is her story that is shaking up the Good Old Boy Network down there in Beaufort County. Look for that interview to hit in the middle part of next week. Also, this coming week, some big news. If you haven't been following Fitz Files, our new true crime podcast, we launched it last month. We're now heading into our 6th episode. We've been covering the Rose Petal murder in Greenville, South Carolina. This is just a truly graphic, crazy case that has taken all sorts of twists and turns. There's a big court hearing in Greenville next week on this story. FITSNews will be there to cover that hearing, so look for that next week. And also, if you have not yet signed up and subscribed, go to Apple, go to Spotify, wherever you download your podcasts, and check out Fitz Files, your new home for true crime, wherever you download those podcasts. We will check you back here next week in the new studio. Updated, upgraded. We'll see what Dylan does with it. But once again, thank you for tuning in. You make all this possible. You make us able to hold these forces accountable in South Carolina and beyond. Keep it tuned to the Week in Review, and we will catch you on the next episode.